Molweni, my name is Huanga Mbeia and I am from South Africa. I stay in the coastline of Gqeberha, and my love for seaweed started when I had the opportunity to study about it in Sweden, Gothenburg University.
I live between Paris and Brittany in France. Brittany is the west coast of France and probably the most complete seaweed ecosystem in the country.
Seaweed is actually part of our daily life in China. My favorite seaweed is kelp. I am a seaweed ambassador for an organization called Safe Seaweed Coalition.
The coalition is a partnership that supports the safe and sustainable scaling up of the global seaweed industry.
I do believe in the absolute need of a program of advocacy based on dialogue and communication towards these various stakeholders and communities.
I'm a graduate student at the University of Victoria in the Spectral Lab, where we map and monitor bull kelp using remote sensing.
What piqued my interest the most was the fact that seaweed grows very fast, and through photosynthesis, it absorbs carbon dioxide at a phenomenal rate. Now, this process, also known as carbon sequestration, could be our answer to global warming and to mitigating the effects of climate change.
And again, we want to move this industry forward.
I really think seaweed has the potential to not just help our ecosystems and biodiversities in the ocean, but also to help the communities along these coastlines. I'm really hoping that seaweed can provide quality, sustainable jobs.
I've discovered a special formula to transform seaweed into a pliable material to create fashion and home decor products.
I like to draw parallels between land-based agricultural systems that I'm familiar with and the seaweed industry that's developing and growing.
So I think it's really important that we have a lot of people talking and thinking about kelp, how to monitor it, how to restore it, and just really recognizing the importance of our kelp forest.
Well, I kind of came up with the saying, whatever the question is, seaweed is the answer, and that's not exaggerating. From food to biofuels, to bioplastic to biofiber.
And I eat it, I dry it, and I put it in all my dishes.
I love to tell others about seaweed because it holds so much promise to support our global food systems and sustainability more broadly.
My advice to anyone wanting to know about seaweed is get involved, be a part of it, be a part of this amazing industry.
Because of all this and more, I am driven to spread the word about the multifaceted treasure trove that seaweed is.
It's a powerhouse that can contribute significantly to many of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals.
I hope you will learn more of seaweed during Seaweed Days.
And I hope you'll join me in the seaweed revolution.
Morning, everyone. Welcome to session number 2 at the second season of Seaweed Days, hosted by Cascadia Seaweed. This session, we're very excited to welcome the Pacific Seaweed Industry Association for putting this session together for us. As we go through the presentation today, I encourage you to put any chat messages or questions into the chat box for us, and we'll monitor those, and we'll take questions at the end of the presentation. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the Executive Director of the Pacific Seaweed Industry Association, Mr. Mark Smith. Take it over, Mark.
Good morning, Erin. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. My name is Mark Smith, as Erin alluded to, and I am the Executive Director of the Pacific Seaweed Industry Association. I am located in Victoria today, and I would like to acknowledge and thank the Lekwungen people, also known as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, for allowing us to live, work, and play on their lands. The PSIA is a nonprofit, member-driven industry association that works to develop industry awareness around the benefits and diverse use values for seaweed. The association collaborates with industry stakeholders and rights holders to develop research-based educational material, new technology, and promote innovation. The organization also advocates to all levels of government for support of this emerging important industry sector. We are thrilled today to be here with our industry partners, Radicle Balance. Radicle is focused on helping companies balance people, planet, and profit. They're a founding company in the emissions reduction industry and, in fact, helped to build Alberta's carbon credit market, the first of its kind in the world. We're also grateful for the support provided by Van City, whose generous financial support will allow Radicle and the PSIA to develop a first of its kind carbon cohort program, of which I will share more details with at the conclusion of this session. With that, I would like to turn it over to Chris Hakes. Chris is a senior manager of the corporate climate solutions with Radicle and will be facilitating the panel. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everyone. Happy Seaweed Days. This is my first, probably not the last, but we are very excited to be your industry partner on this. Many thanks to the PSIA. First off, I want to recognize that I'm coming to you from the ancestral lands and waters of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish First Nations. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the links and the opportunities between seaweed and carbon accounting and markets. And warning, it's even more exciting than it sounds. So just first off, a bit about who we are. Christine, yeah, thanks. So Radicle, as Mark alluded to, has been around for a while, actually about 15 years. We're focused on the business of carbon. We're supporting organizations that are committed to low carbon pathways. Our business lines include emissions measurement and reduction strategies, including a training program we'll tell you about today. We develop carbon offset projects in both the compliance sectors, which means those are legally obliged, and the voluntary, which we'll be touching upon today. We developed over half the credits in Alberta last year, so we've been in this business a long time and we do a lot of good work. We do emissions software development, and we have a trade desk under which we've transacted over 400 million tons of CO2e. To briefly set the global emissions context, as we all know, fast and deep cuts. Sorry, Christine, not to the next one just yet. To briefly set the emissions context, we need fast and deep cuts to emissions to meet targets of reducing global greenhouse emissions by 50% by 2030, and the goal of achieving net zero emissions by 2050. These are audacious goals. But as of fall 2021, over 68% of global GDP is now tied to a net zero target. This is important. And to meet these targets, offsets will play a role, and removals will be a critical source for reduction. When I say removals, we'll talk about that moment when Christine speaks. The market, but most important for this audience, the market has signaled great interest in blue carbon credits. And these are what seaweed would fit into, and we'll get into this again in a few minutes. So why is Radicle here? We'd like to bring our carbon expertise to support this emerging industry. We see enormous potential for carbon projects that bring a suite of climate and development benefits to the world and our coastlines. The seaweed industry is going to play an increasingly important role in these low carbon strategies, and frankly, we want to be a part of it. Next slide, please, Christine. So over the next 45 to 50 minutes, because we want to leave time for questions, we will cover three main topics. One, the basics of how to account for carbon emissions in your operations. Two, how carbon projects work. And three, how carbon markets work. As a bit of housekeeping, we do want this to be something of a conversation. While we will present, please do capture your questions in the chat that will come, and we'll have to, as I said, at the end, we'll hold 5, maybe 10 minutes if we can for questions at the end. Now, all this carbon jargon can be a bit of overwhelming if you're not steeped in daily emissions discussions like we are. The good news that any great adventure, it starts at the beginning. In this case, it starts with knowing your own emissions. So joining me today, we're going to have two of my colleagues, Christine and Jeff. We'll start with Jeff because he is an expert on the basics of carbon accounting. He's one of our client advisors at Climate Smart, Radicle, and I'm going to hand it over to you now, Jeff. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chris. So as Chris mentioned, I'm a sustainability advisor here in the Climate Smart group at Radicle. So my main focus in my day-to-day is helping companies identify, account for, and reduce their emissions. So at Climate Smart here, we have helped thousands of small and medium-sized businesses from almost every sector of the economy manage their emissions. I'm sure many of you are aware of the basics of climate change and climate science. and the problem society faces in this area. If you're not sure about it, I'm happy to answer some questions about it at the end. My focus here is to give you some insight into what taking action means for your business. I'm going to take you through the process and then, as I mentioned, answer any questions you may have. So what does carbon management look like for a business? Looking at our charts here. So first off, it just begins with asking, what activities does your company, its employees, and its operations participate in that emit carbon? Do we have vehicles that burn fuel? Do we ship products out to market? How much waste do we send to the landfill? So once we've identified those, we're asking, how can those activities be measured so that we can figure out how many emissions they release? Is there any data available on those sources? Next step is reporting, letting employees, investors, the public, other stakeholders know that this is what our company is emitting. Almost every business in the economy is contributing to climate change. So by reporting your emissions, you're sending the message that you've acknowledged your contribution. Lastly, looking at what can be done to reduce your emissions. How can your operations become more efficient? And are there any incentive programs out there to help us? So the questions above are the questions that we at Climate Smart assist companies with answering. So starting off, next slide, Christine. So starting off, obviously it's very hard to reduce your emissions if you do not know where they're coming from or how significant they are. We can account for our emissions by measuring greenhouse gas inventories. So they are calculated yearly and reported in tons of CO2 per year. Measuring a greenhouse gas inventory is kind of like doing your yearly taxes. Quite often more interesting, but maybe slightly harder to get the information. So how do we know what to measure? Well, we need to first off identify and classify our emission sources. Next slide, Christine. So this fun-looking graphic in the beautiful Radicle company colors describes how businesses classify their emission sources. Within the many terms and acronyms that you may have heard related to carbon emissions, emission scopes are one of the most important from an individual company perspective. So what does scope mean? Well, why don't we quickly go through them? Scope 1, or direct emissions. So these are emissions from energy use from sources that your company owns or leases or generally has control over. So think of your company-owned vehicles, company facilities, maybe you own industrial refrigerators, motorboats, things like that. So those are the emissions that your company kind of has direct control of. Scope 2 emissions are ones that are shared with the utilities that provide electricity, steam heating, and cooling. So think of your electricity consumption from BC Hydro. You share the responsibility of these emissions with your utility provider. Scope 3 emissions are emissions occurring in your company's upstream and downstream value chain, as well as from activities undertaken by employees on behalf of your business. Now, obviously, you could go many levels up and down the supply chain, but we typically encourage companies to just go 1 or 2 levels into their supply chain. Common Scope 3 activities we tend to measure may include employee business travel, waste from operations, transportation and distribution of supplies and products, employee commuting, and several others. All right, so I think we can move on, Christine. So what does this mean for the seaweed industry? Obviously, this very complex and technical diagram should explain everything to you, but in case it doesn't, I will describe a couple of sources that I think may be present looking from a glance. So I see emissions associated with powering and maintaining temperature at nurseries. There's fuel burned transporting seed stock in likely heavy trucks to farms. At the farms, I'd imagine you need fuel-consuming boats to maintain and harvest seaweeds, and I'm sure there are some buildings using natural gas and electricity at the farm sites. Drying or freezing seaweed after harvest may require industrial refrigerants or natural gas. More transportation afterwards. That's usually a big theme whenever you're making products. Processing seaweed into products will undoubtedly contribute emissions. And then, of course, sending those products to market will again require some fuel consumption in one type of vehicle or another. Of course, we have to go through the exercise of identifying and measuring a greenhouse gas inventory to really hone in on those sources. So moving along with the process, we've identified our sources. Let's say we've measured our emissions from them. What now? Well, we have to manage them. So this right here is kind of a hierarchy of actions that can be taken to manage greenhouse gas emissions. So starting at the top, avoiding carbon-intensive activities. The pandemic was actually really great for this from our perspective, maybe not so great for other things, but it really reduced business travel. Employees everywhere were switching to working from home. And, you know, we at Radicle were telling businesses to do this stuff for years. So I'm going to give us partial credit on some of the changes that were made by businesses during that time. Next is reducing your emissions. So basically doing whatever you do more efficiently and with less fuel. Next is replacing higher carbon energy sources with lower carbon ones, maybe ones that include seaweed. So this can be fuel switching or electrification. And finally, offsetting emissions that cannot be eliminated. These are part of the toolkit, as there will always be emissions that you cannot avoid or reduce to zero. So looking at this pyramid as a whole, it's often cheaper and more impactful starting with actions at the top of the pyramid and working downwards. Next slide, Christine. So you may be wondering why should I reduce my emissions if I'm a smaller business and my impact is very minor compared to larger emissions intensive companies? So these are just a couple of the common benefits that our clients have experienced going through the emissions management process. So first off is increasing operational efficiencies and reducing costs. Can you reduce your dependency on fossil fuels so that high gas prices like the ones we are currently experiencing don't have as much of an impact on the bottom line? That could be staying ahead of regulations. More government climate policies are coming, and if you're an early mover in this area, then you can stand to gain a competitive advantage when they do arrive. Next is attracting investors and customers, as well as employee retention and attraction. People want to support and invest in companies with lower climate risk who can showcase positive action in this area. And there are quite a few more benefits that your company may experience if you choose to manage your emissions, but you have to go through the process to find out. Christine, do you mind the next slide? Thank you. So focusing back on the seaweed industry, we've got a couple of examples that I was thinking about that may be able to be taken. So asking yourself, could you improve your facility lights and heating so they consume less electricity? Can Can you get assessments to find out where energy is being wasted at offices and facilities? Is there electric options for the equipment and vehicles that you currently use? If there isn't now, there likely is some coming. Can you influence behavior change in your employees, suppliers, or vendors that may reduce emissions? So we typically tailor reduction planning to businesses' largest emission sources. Now, looking at some concrete examples, we'll take a look at a couple of marine companies who have seen great results after measuring and managing their emissions. So first off, Neptune Terminals. So they are a bulk shipping terminal located in North Vancouver. Measured their emissions for almost 10 years. And as you can imagine, they had quite a bit of fuel burning equipment. So they focused on reducing their emissions through electrifying their equipment and switching to cleaner burning fuels, such as biodiesel. They also built sustainability into their culture through contracts with suppliers, enhanced contractor requirements, and providing incentives for their employees to change to lower carbon commuting habits. They are now a much more efficient business and have had significant savings from reduced fuel use, even as their operations increased. Let's look at another one. Sam Towage Canada. So quite a large international organization and its Canadian arm. So as you can imagine, they have quite a few tugboats, and their big focus was reducing the amount of fuel their tugboats used, which is kind of a core part of their business. So they are in the process of upgrading to more efficient tugboat engines and then using shore power to supplement that fuel use. They're actually on track to monetize their emission reductions with Radicle's help, of course, by generating credits through BC's low carbon fuel standard. So not only can you save costs and accrue some of the other benefits that I've mentioned, maybe in the future you can generate revenue. So these aren't the only marine-based organizations that we've worked with. Radicle has a ton of experience working with numerous marine-based organizations on emissions management. So if you're interested in capturing the benefits of emission reductions, you can join the cohort of businesses generously supported by our friends at Van City and get started with the Climate Smart program. So that's it for me. I really want to thank you for listening to me ramble on about measuring carbon emissions. Now I'm going to pass the mic over to my great colleague, Christine Ward, to take us further in this ocean carbon journey.
All right, thanks so much, Jeff. I have a headset that is acting up, so hopefully the lawn mowing outside is not a massive bother, but we should be okay. So I wanted to really go over, Jeff outlined some of the key points when we talk about carbon credits are a really interesting point of conversation right now, where people think that they're the future. I'm one of those people. I think that they're really awesome. Let's leverage capitalism, whether we agree or disagree with it, to make environmental change. And that's what I get to tell my friends at the bar, which always, brings up an interesting conversation. But essentially, not a lot of people understand what needs to happen to generate carbon credits. And this last M word, monetize, that we talk about, there's a lot of things that have to happen before that monetization of carbon credits actually happens. And so Jeff talked about measuring and really looking through your inventory of greenhouse gas emissions, and not every single thing that creates an emissions reduction creates a carbon credit. So I wanted to go over some really basic carbon credit information right now, so that when we get into the further conversation that Chris Hayes is going to take us through, we can understand what it means for carbon credits. And then Radicle's really, really excited to be involved in this space and to be able to be looking at future projects that we don't actually have the pathway for carbon credits yet, but we are on the edge of our seat waiting for, those protocols, which I'll tell you what that means, to drop so we can start generating these credits. And I'll tell you kind of how that happens. So what is a carbon credit? Really, really basic. Why do we only measure, it seems, in carbon? Well, we don't. Basically, when you cut emissions, and there's a couple other qualifiers and eligibility, which I'll talk about later, you measure all of those in greenhouse gases. And there's a bunch of different greenhouse gases, and they all have different impacts on the environment. But we equate them to carbon because it's sort of like if there was a different currency for every city in a country. It'd be really difficult to figure out what, a bobblehead in Edmonton was worth versus a bobblehead in Calgary if, we're always constantly using exchange rates. So we just put everything into carbon because it's much easier for us to then understand what are the impacts. So for example, methane is 25 times as good at keeping heat in the atmosphere. So 25 times as bad. When you reduce 1 ton of methane, you get 25 carbon credits. And that's just kind of how we equate it to make it really easy to talk about. So we're not just talking about carbon, but we do use carbon as our single identifier. And then that is what ends up being a carbon credit. So a carbon credit is actually made up of a bunch of different GHGs sometimes, but we just talk about carbon just to keep it simple. So registries. Really, really quickly, there are 2 types of registries. There's the voluntary registries and the compliance registries. Within the voluntary space, you're talking about, Vera, Gold Standard, a bunch of mostly kind of private-esque institutions that are innovating carbon credits in a really miraculous way, and they're absolutely fantastic. They're not usually geographically strict, so you can typically have a methodology or protocol that expands across different geographies within the voluntary registry, whereas in the compliance, it's a little bit more strict. And these credits, once they're generated, can be bought and sold internationally. So again, not as strict on sort of geographical or what we call jurisdiction. And then in compliance, think government. So these are typically driven by regulatory environments. The Alberta TIER program is a great example of a regulatory compliance market. The low carbon fuel standard in BC and in California are interesting kind of compliance registries. And the instruction manual for these 2 types of registries is, they're called methodologies and protocols. And so basically you have a registry and they have a bunch of different project types. So it might be agriculture, and within agriculture, you have a no-till farming project type, and that is what you would be looking at in terms of a protocol or methodology for the instructions on how to generate carbon credits. So it would lay out all the math and all of the things that you need to do to make that possible. And then you'd actually have your project and you generate carbon credits from it. So the last piece about compliance, I mentioned that voluntary is a little bit more loose. Sometimes it's all dependent on the methodology or the protocol. So these all have asterisks on them, but in the compliance market, you can typically only generate and trade those credits within that space. So in Alberta, you have to generate the credit in Alberta, you have to trade the credit in Alberta, you have to retire the credit in Alberta, just a little bit more strict. Chris mentioned carbon removals. So what's really, really exciting in this space, personally, I am all nature-based solutions. At Radicle, we sort of divide our efforts into nature-based industrials, and so industrials are oil and gas and a lot of like methane management and things like that. And we have an awesome team that does that. I focus on forests and soil and agriculture and all of that. And within nature-based, there's a lot of really cool removals, and that's where seaweed it might be able to play a role. And so when you're talking about carbon removals, you have carbon removals and avoided emissions, and these are both types of offsets. Avoided emissions are like driving an electric vehicle rather than driving my Xterra and filling up with a pump and using that emission. A removal is actually removing carbon from the carbon cycle. So within the carbon cycle, we have a ton of carbon. We have a lot of anthropogenic carbon, which means that humans created carbon in that carbon cycle. And removals provide this opportunity to like suck the carbon out, store it, sink it, sequester it. It's very, very cool. So those credits are actually, you're seeing sort of a really interesting play in the market. And I won't take Chris's thunder, but it's really, really cool what's happening with removals and the increased value and revenue streams you can get from that. So what kind of is our plan? I have, world domination plans, and seaweed is definitely a part of it. My world domination plan started with aggregating carbon credits for solar in Alberta. So Radicle started its business 14 years ago, aggregating carbon credits. And basically what that means is that carbon credits are complicated to produce, and figuring out all the registries and where you need to go and storing the data and all of that can be quite onerous. So Radicle took it on to aggregate a bunch of little projects. So we had farms all across Alberta where we were aggregating for a specific protocol. And now last year, I started the program for solar. So anyone with a solar panel in Alberta, no matter the size, can generate carbon credits through our program. So we have, Jane with a 5 kilowatt system on her house, and we have Paul with a 10 megawatt system, on a farm, and both of those people can generate carbon credits. So it's this idea of democratizing carbon credits and bringing them to everyone and creating value for smaller projects because they're still making an impact. I have dreams to do this potentially for seaweed. So the benefits of carbon credits are that there's additional revenue streams. Jeff kind of alluded to that. And there's an ability to track emissions reductions through carbon credits. So even if you don't want the revenue streams, you can use carbon credits as a way to tokenize your carbon impact through maybe your seaweed plants or your mangrove forest, or et cetera, et cetera. So we want to eventually do this because we've done it with online farms. So why not do it with on sea farm? The final quantification for this carbon that's sequestered through seaweed is currently unknown. We're waiting literally on the edge of our seat for some results that are going to come out. The studies are supposed to be completed by the end of this year, and then they will go to, and already have started going to VERA, which is a voluntary registry, to start getting that instruction booklet or that methodology written. Oceans 2050 had an update in March that I read through a couple times, and it's really interesting. You can kind of get into what the actual quantification of each hectare of seaweed, what's the carbon sequestered, and that's going to be what leads to how many carbon credits. As you can imagine, that math kind of flows. And that registry, VERA, is expected to release the protocol next year. So we are ready to go as soon as this protocol is ready to go, and as soon as we have that instruction manual. Now I'm going to pass it off to Mr. Christopher Hakes, or Chakes, and he's going to talk about a little bit about the trading side. So I walked through some really fast basic information. I'm happy to walk anyone through it at a slower rate. I know I speak very fast, but Chakes really has an amazing insight on what happens once you have the carbon credits and what's happening with this tokenization. I work more in the how to generate, and he's the pass that I pass the ball off to figure out what to do with the actual credits. So I'm super pumped for you to gain some of his knowledge, and I will pass it off now.
Thanks, Christine. And thanks for warning us about your plans for world domination. Duly warned. So we have covered a lot so far. There's one element I'm going to still get into. So just to reiterate, we've learned about how to measure your operational emissions. We learned about how projects work, and I know there's a lot more detail there. Please, again, I see there's some chatter going on, but we'll be looking for questions in about 10 or 15 minutes. What I'm going to get into is the voluntary carbon market. So you have measured your emissions. Sometimes you've got a project. Sometimes you're just doing emissions reductions. Let's separate those things. In any event, once you have a project, what do you do with the credits? That's what I'm going to get into now. So if you could move to the next slide, please, Christine. Which breaks every rule of PowerPoint presentations, which is not a great place to start, but I know the amount of information on the slide is overwhelming, and it's intended to be. Please just pay attention to the red arrows. All I'm trying to suggest here is that the voluntary carbon market, or the VCM, is not new. I think a lot of people assume that it is a new market. It goes back over 20 years, and the origins go back to the earliest forestry protection projects in Latin America. Kyoto was ratified in 2005. That is the first area you'll see on the left. And since then, there's been tremendous growth. This is the Pierce, but I mark this Kyoto area as where the period where the process became highly formalized. About 5 years later, 2010, Microsoft launched its first internal carbon pricing system. They've continued to be a leader, but this early pricing system put a real stake in the ground for corporate action. And that same year also marked California's cap and trade system activation. So, fast forward to today, where we see over 2,000 large companies with net zero commitments. And I'll talk a bit more about net zero in a moment. But given all this, I'll spend the next few minutes kind of breaking down what are the key elements of the voluntary carbon markets. Next slide, please, Christine. So how big is it? So this graph gives you a sense of the volume of credits traded and its volatile history. Again, keep in mind that a credit is equivalent to 1 ton of emissions reductions. So it's hard to determine a predictable trend, as you'll see in this graph, until about 2017, where we began to see clear pathways and increased and steadily increasing corporate commitments. Up until 2020, the total tracked in any given year was between $200 and $400 million. But as of August 21, so less than a year ago, transactions had already exceeded 748 million in that year, but went on to eclipse over 1 billion in transactions in 2021. And this year, 2022, we anticipate this will be exceeding $1.5 billion. Now, relative to compliance markets at around 300 billion globally, pardon me, it's still a relatively small market, but you can see the growth has been enormous of late. However, given the current expected corporate commitments, the growth is going to increase. So according to McKinsey and other good data sources, we anticipate that the market will grow somewhere between 10 and 50x between now and 2030. Next slide, please, Christine. As for where these issued credits are housed, so you have a project, you create credits, and then they are issued, and then you move them onto a registry. Once a credit is verified and issued, it's uploaded to an appropriate registry and listed where are the dominant registries in the voluntary carbon markets. Again, there's a lot of data there, but please just pay attention to the red arrow. You'll see the dominant one is VCS or Verra. Now, these registries house all of the relevant documentation for a given project. You could dig into these and see project idea notes, project overviews, validation certificates, verification reports, issuances, etc. Now, while there has been valid criticism of the opacity of the voluntary carbon markets in the past, particularly around pricing, and that's legit, transparency is paramount in our markets. And in fact, the amount of publicly available data is astonishing if you compare it to any other industry. You just have to dig for it. But this is all publicly available information. But this slide, and again, just gives you a sense of kind of the dominant registries. And when we start talking about projects, when Christine starts digging into your numbers and helping you to build one, Verra is probably the dominant standard we'll be looking at. Next slide, please. I think this is where it's really important to think about, because it's one thing to produce credits, it's one thing to issue and then have them. We still need to think about who's going to buy them and what they're going to buy. So there are a tremendous number of project types, but they can broadly be broken down into 4 dominant categories. There's agriculture, forestry, and land use, otherwise known as AFOLU, or nature-based solutions, as Christine referenced. There's renewable energy, energy efficiency, and industrial types of projects. Now, again, given all offsets of 1 ton of emissions reductions at their core, credit selection vis-a-vis the end user or buyer normally comes down to one of the following criteria. They're interested in the project type, they're interested in project location, price, and is there a story, are there sustainable development goals or kind of charisma story behind it. So if it's driven by price alone, often it's the more industrial projects that get selected by end users. However, if it's a more client-facing company, often it's aligned with their ESG targets, that's environmental, social, and governance targets, possibly sustainable development goals they have called out as an organization. But why do they buy offsets? Fundamentally, and I think Christine touched upon this, the drivers of offset purchases are accelerating reductions for those emissions that are hard to abate. In other words, those emissions that they can't reduce otherwise, they look to offsets. They want to manage risk. They want to create goodwill among their stakeholders. They are meeting client demands. They want to strengthen social license and fundamentally hedge against what we know to be increasing costs of carbon. On to the next slide, please. Again, kind of drawing this into our own personal experience here, but this is project location, again, is one of those critical criteria. So as far as how these jurisdictions break down over the whole voluntary market, again, I've made a little indicator there. You can see how North America, relative to the rest of the world, plays a small role in hosting fewer of the 10% of total credits transacted. Now, projects tend to happen in those jurisdictions where price per ton of carbon abated is lowest and opportunities are the highest. So in my experience, we know that European buyers take a global perspective. In other words, they will buy projects from around the globe. American buyers prefer this hemisphere, and Canadians particularly want projects in their own backyard. I have a lot of clients who are looking for Canadian projects. Everyone does. So given the market demand and desire for Canadian projects, we think there's a great deal of opportunity right here in our backyard. And next slide, please. So that's a bit of a teaser. concludes our remarks around GHG accounting, project development, and the voluntary carbon markets. So we've got a few minutes for questions. I know there's some in the chat. I haven't been paying attention recently because I've been chatting so much, but we'll go to those in a moment. I think Erin's going to come back on and help me to manage those. Thanks.
Hello, welcome back. My goodness sakes, there's so much information here to take in that I'm hoping we're going to draw a little bit more out during this Q&A portion. You know, there's something that wasn't particularly clear to me, and I'm hoping one of you can address this for me. What does your day-to-day look like? What do you guys do at Radicle?
Why don't we go in order? Maybe Jeff, you start, because as you've heard, we've all got very different functions. You know, the business does a lot of different businesses in the GHG accounting world, from Jeff's work in accounting for small businesses, medium size. Christine's developing projects. I'm selling them. So maybe Jeff, you want to talk a bit about what you do day to day?
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. So my day-to-day involves working with our small, medium-sized business clients to go through the process that I kind of went through. So any day can be helping clients figure out where to capture their data on emissions sources, working with them to identify those sources. You know, there may be research into particular, you know, government incentives or particular kind of reduction strategies for clients. A lot of kind of coaching them through the process and moral support when they get frustrated and cannot find the data that they're looking for. And occasionally, you know, passing our clients and connecting them to other teams if they want to purchase offsets or look into some of the more other emission reduction types. So I'd say that's mostly my days.
So Jeff, let me ask you, if I'm a small business owner and I don't really know where to start, but I know that I want to reduce my emissions, I want to track my emissions, do I contact you first?
Yes. So you can contact me. We'll set you up on a kind of introductory coaching call, and we'll really kind of dive into your business to figure out where those emission sources are coming from and give you a bit of a plan to go and collect the data from those emissions. We also, as mentioned off the top, we are a bit of a software company as well. So we have an emissions tracking software that does a lot of the heavy lifting on my end as well.
Amazing, because I imagine you don't just set emissions to know where you are today, but you're setting goals to reduce them over the longer term. Great.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for that. Christine, what does a day-to-day look like for you? Other than joining us for Mindful Morning and yoga in the park.
Yeah, I did another ocean dip yesterday, which I said to my partner, any dip for this Ontario person on this coast is a polar dip. I don't care what month it is. I'm polar dipping. It's way too cold to call it anything else. But yeah, no, my day-to-day, there really isn't a day-to-day, kind of more like a week to week. It can be pretty, we'll find a project or have a call that's really has a lot of potential, and we'll chase that. And so being nature-based solutions, my team and I, we take a bunch of incoming leads. So if we take a lead and we don't punt it off to Jeff because it's that exact situation you just described, Erin, it might be someone in, you know, a country in Eastern Europe that has an agricultural project that they're doing what's called regenerative agriculture. And we're going to pop in and help them. They're already doing the project type. They need to figure out how to generate the actual credits for it. So we would go in and we would probably sell some advisory work. So Radicle has a really wicked team of some of the like top experts in the world in the areas that we focus on in our advisory team. And so when we first bring in an initial client, we'll try and figure out essentially the landscape. So, you know, what are the opportunities that are available to them? What are they actually doing? And where's the emission reduction happening? And then if there might be a bunch of protocols that could be possible to go after with different registries. So then you have to pick which one. And Radicle's team is really, you know, in the place to decide those types of things. And so that's that is an example of, for any type of project type. So it might be regenerative agriculture, it might be a forestry project, it might be, my students doing a bunch of research into mangroves right now, because we could be on the other end where if we don't get a mangrove lead, but we think it's awesome, we will go and find it, right? So outreach and researching who is doing this right now, and kind of balancing the current clients, current leads with the what's coming down the pipeline and what do we need to be on the edge of our seats for, because I feel like that's my theme of seaweed. It's just on the edge of my seat. So really varied, but just looking at where are the emissions reductions happening in general? Where are they happening where there's carbon credit potential through an existing protocol? And what do we chase first? There's a lot of shiny objects, and we could spend all day looking at them, but prioritization is key for me to not go insane.
Yeah, for sure. So before we move over to Christine, maybe you can tell me a little about the difference between direct and indirect emissions and how credits are generated for those.
That might be a better question for Jeff,
Sure.
In terms of direct and indirect emissions.
It was a question that came up in the chat, and I just thought this was an appropriate time to dive in.
Yeah, Jeff, if you want to answer the first part, and I can dive in for the how credits might be generated. But yeah, that's more that's a measure. That's a step one. I'm on the monetize.
Yeah, so happy to speak to the first part of the question. So direct and indirect emissions, those are kind of just other words for the scopes that I was mentioning. So direct emissions are those scope ones emission sources which your company kind of owns. It can come from equipment completely owned or leased by your company, or just sources that your company kind of has full control over. Whereas indirect, in the scopes 2 and 3, those are kind of shared emissions. So thinking of the shared emissions with your electricity provider, or the shared emissions with your transportation and distribution company you use. So those emissions are kind of your company's portion of another company's emissions, and that's you taking responsibility because those are emissions produced by your company's activities but owned by another company. And I'll pass it off to Christine for credit generation.
Yeah, I was like just messaging Jeff because that's what I thought. So I'm glad I have like my definitions. So the piece about that that's really relevant for credit generation is that the carbon credits always lie with the person that's making the emissions reductions. So for example, I had a company call me when I first started. Ever since I started at Radicle, I've been taking all of our cold leads. So anyone like Bill with 10 trees in his backyard to, like Sally that's trying to create some hyper focus machine. So I have a breadth of what people think will generate carbon credits. But I had this person contact me and they said, well, we have a logging company and we leave the wood waste in the forest. The wood waste decomposes, releases emissions. We want to take that out of the forest. We're going to put it into bedding for an animal, and then it's not going to emit, the carbon. And I was like, okay, great. That sounds awesome. What are you using to transport the wood waste back? Is the wood waste as a weight creating more emissions? Because if it's a diesel truck, it's now putting more diesel into the atmosphere by actually bringing those back. This is like the full life cycle thing. They said, okay, yeah, we are doing that. So even if I use an EV vehicle to get the wood waste out, then it goes into animal bedding. The animals use it for 20 years, maybe. It's a really great bedding. What happens then? Does it go to a landfill and then just decompose there? It's like this full cycle. And what happens is that whoever made the emissions reduction, so avoided that carbon entering the atmosphere in the full cycle of things, would be the owner of the emissions reduction. So in that example, if it then went to a landfill where there was a completely enclosed anaerobic digester, and we were capturing all the emissions that came off of the decomposition of those wood shavings in that animal bed, the owner of the landfill with the anaerobic digester gets the credits, not the person that pulled it from the wood waste, not the person that used it in their animal beds, but the actual person that's making the emissions reductions at the end. So with solar panels, whoever owns the solar panel owns the emission associated with the solar panel. And so that's kind of, in those indirect and direct examples, chase down who's actually making the emissions reduction. If you have a feed additive for enteric methane, seaweed is a great possibility for that. the farmer putting it all into their cows is going to be the producer of that, not the person that created the feed additive, not the person that came up with the science. It's going to be the farmer that's actually putting it on their cattle, that owns it legally. And then lawyers come involved, and contracting can happen, and the environmental attributes can transfer ownership. But that's where it kind of happens. So it's almost always like direct, like the most direct type of ownership, but a little bit different than this ownership over what you're emitting into the environment in scope 1, 2, and 3, if that helps to answer the question.
And opens up so many more questions. So the first question that comes to mind is duration. What kind of time scale are we measuring things against? And then, yeah, well, let's start there. Let's start with duration.
In terms of when the actual emissions reductions are happening and things like that?
Well, it's such an interesting concept. How long are we measuring the life cycle for? Because it continues on, you know, every day, every year, and keeps going. Christopher, maybe you can help clarify my question around duration.
I'd be happy to. Yeah, thanks for asking the question. And I raised my hand only because I can see the path this is taking, which I've seen before. And sometimes, so we're talking about Jeff and Christine, to be very clear, talking about two very different activities, right? So Jeff is generally talking about, we are a business, we want to measure our emissions, we want to reduce them. So that process is to, first of all, go through an accounting process, make emissions reductions, and maybe, just maybe, you will buy offsets to, you know, reduce them to zero. Full stop. What Christine is talking about is actually developing a carbon offset project, and they are very different animals, these two things, right? So what Jeff is talking about when you're talking about emissions is year over year, you're constantly making emissions reductions. You will measure, you reduce, and offset, and sometimes next year you do the same thing. I think what you're getting into, Aaron, which is going to talk about getting into the weeds. Pardon the pun. This can go. We could go very deep on this, right? Because I think even someone said in here, in the chat, was talking about removals and permanency. Now, I don't want to go into a deep hole on this, but it's a great question, and you've raised it well here in that each project we have has a project timeline, right? So if you're talking about an offset project, not again what Jeff is doing, but what Christine's working on. So if, for example, if you have a solar project where you have avoided emissions, those are permanent, right? Because those emissions never happened and they never will, because you've eliminated diesel or whatever the fossil fuel source was going to be. If, however, we're talking about removal projects, which are this nascent project type in the offset world, typically around afforestation, reforestation, sometimes around direct air capture. I won't get into that, but you know, that's too much for us today. But when it comes to a nature-based removal solution, permanency, meaning how long are those emissions sequestered, is a critical component. Now, how do you measure it? So in some cases, they talk, and it's funny because permanence is a relative, shouldn't be, but it's a relative term in our world. So in a forestry project, sometimes permanence, I'm using the inverted commas, will be 30 to 100 years, depending on the project type. Sometimes in the direct air capture, they are considered a 1,000-year project in terms of permanence. The point is, the emissions have to be removed as quickly as possible to avoid the deepest problems around the climate emergency. So it's a little bit splitting hairs when you think about the permanence between 30 years and 100 years, et cetera. The point is that you're removing them immediately, and they're for a period of time which is considered broadly into the permanent section of what we do. Does that help?
Yes, I suppose it's all industry specific. So, for example, yes, somebody just posted in the chat, Cascadia Seaweed is part of this global research study to quantify just how long carbon could be sequestered by seaweed farming, permanently sequestered into the deep ocean. And this is we are one of 21 farms around the world that are studying the substrate below the farms to determine where the detritus from the seaweed is going and how that carbon is stored and whether it flows to the deep ocean and therefore then can be considered permanently sequestered. So if I put my seaweed hat on and I think about this as an industry specific solution, then I can understand Christine's challenge and opportunity of seeing all of the different opportunities and almost holding a crystal ball to see how to prioritize these nature-based solutions. So thank you for going down that rabbit hole with me. Chris, did you want to go a little bit more into what?
Well, yeah, sorry, you see me nodding because I can see the comments coming from Jennifer and others, which are great. And Wiley, clearly these are experts who also know about this space. So yes, I mean, I think, Jennifer, to touch upon your comment, this is why the methodologies are not finalized, right? We're still working out all the science because there's a lot of work still to be done. So this is exactly how does this translate to credits if long term is 100 years? Good question. Working on it. So that's it for the moment. But we'll happy to follow up on a separate chat if you want, Jennifer.
This is Dr. Jennifer Clark, the phycologist at Cascadia Seaweed. She always have amazing questions. She holds us all accountable and challenges us all daily. We appreciate her perspective so much. So there was a question earlier in the chat about shore power for boats. Can somebody explain what that is to me?
Yeah, I can take this one. So shore power, it's a pretty common fixture here in the Port of Vancouver, but essentially it just describes the process of providing electrical power from the shore to a vessel that is at berth there, therefore allowing their fossil fuel burning engines to be turned off. So quite often before shore power, boats had to still run their engines while they were in at the dock to power some of the basic services of the boat. And now shore power kind of alleviates that need to run the engines while at berth. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think so. I'm watching the chat to see if this the person who asked the question had any follow-up there. But Chris, did you have anything to expand on, or was that?
I always do, don't I? Just see me nodding away. Yeah, no, okay. So it sounds like Jeff obviously did a dynamite job. I would say that, we noticed the difference, for example, I'm sure anyone who does live in a coastal community, because a lot of the larger ships are not just burning, gasoline or something. They're building, burning like a bunker fuel. So the delta between shore power and business as usual with burning bunker fuel is enormous, both from a GHG perspective as well as an air quality perspective. So it's an enormous difference. It's a simple change, but it doesn't happen without sometimes there being an offset mechanism in place.
Great. Christine, there's a question in the chat directed to you. I'm just going to read it out so I get it right from the perspective of the question asker. Who is involved in the voluntary credit protocol development? Or is the seaweed carbon credit generation verification being done internally by Radicle? It seems that air, sea, CO2 gas exchange experts in the field have largely been left out of the conversation.
Yeah, I saw that too. And Patrick, I just connected with you on LinkedIn, so maybe we can have an offline chat about it. Radicle does develop protocols and methodologies. We typically focus our efforts to do that in the Alberta compliance market because our experts are really, really valuable in that market based on what they're experts in. Not to say we don't do it elsewhere and that we can't, but this methodology, all of the things we've said, we don't know. There is a lot of conversation about even if we could prove what the sequestration was by deep sea sinking, we don't know what the ecological impacts of warming that deep sea potential with this decomposing seaweed is. Like there's so many pieces to this, but the hope down the line and the light at the end of the line for me is like mangroves. And so like bit of a tangent, but looking at what's happening with mangroves and the fact that there has been proof points and we can sort of see the sequestration potential with mangroves being sort of what I say is like the buddy sibling connection from forests to ocean, in the sense that they're a little bit of both, but they're way better than boreal forests in a variety of different ways. And so in terms of developing the protocol and the methodology, we aren't we don't have our finger in that pie other than me just being nerdy and making sure I get all the updates all the time. But a couple of the links that I posted, so Oceans 50 got funding to do the research study that Aaron was talking about with I think it's 21 different seaweed farms in a variety of different geographical areas, because that's also going to impact like species and area and sediment, and like tidal flow could impact carbon sequestration. So we want to make sure we're getting a really good indication, and the protocol usually will list out the different areas and the different sequestration that happens within those. So to kind of cover and quell the fear of protocols don't get written, methodologies don't get written sloppily, they take a long time. And so that's why I've been on the edge of my seat and my butt's getting sore, because they take a really long time because people care about them. They want to make sure that they're actually making the impact that they're saying they're making in the protocol. Radicle's involved from we will support in any way, shape, or form. I'll say it again, if anyone needs support, we will support if we can support. We are super excited to see this potentially come about, but it's the team at Vera is working on this, and they have a blue carbon expert there who's amazing. There are a variety of different teams, I'm very excited about this, listed on the Oceans 50 website. They're working on it. Cascadia is involved. So these are the people to talk to. There's a variety of different people involved. And again, to say to quell the fear of this just being a non-legitimate sequestration thing, when you get a bunch of people that care about it working on it together, and there's, the more ears that hear it and the more eyes that are seeing it, there's a lot less risk of it being something that's not legitimate. So we are not actually Radicle developing this internally. And if you feel like your industry has been left out, I think there are a variety of different people that could be reached out to, but I will say it's really preliminary. So I don't think decisions are being made in absence of other industries. But this, if you feel like you're being left out, there are a lot of people that you can chat with. It's not Radicle, there are a lot of people working on it. And you can go to that Oceans 50 website that I posted and sort of look at those links, or talk to someone at Cascadia, because they have a lot of knowledge in the space as well.
Okay. We have 12 minutes left, and this is the question on my mind. How do we value these credits?
I think that's probably a question for me. Do you want that, Christine? So
no,
how do you value? Thanks for the question. And as I mentioned during my remarks, when you say value, just to clarify, you're talking about actually monetary value, because of course there's huge ecological, okay. So great question. And again, this is where the VCS, the voluntary carbon markets, have been criticized in the past, and it's still an issue, right? There's an opacity to sharing of pricing. We know that because it's been a relatively small market, only certain companies have gotten involved, and there's no central repository saying these credits went for this price. So to some degree, pricing is driven by two elements. One is, what does it cost to produce a credit? So for example, I mentioned solar, we talked about industrial, et cetera. So in the case of industrial, let's take, landfill gas as an example. Typically in that, you are reducing the amount of methane that is being emitted from a landfill by capping it, and maybe you are reusing that gas, or maybe you are flaring it, because as Christine mentioned, if you're releasing methane, it's 22 times as strong, more or less, than a CO2. So they are reducing emissions, but it's really not an expensive process to cap and then to burn. If you, however, look at something like a forestry project or an equivalent seaweed project, where you have a lot of operational staff, you have overhead costs of verification, et cetera, which can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. So the projects need to be of a certain scale in order to justify the economics. Those have a lot more cost associated with them. So that is one element of where it comes. So what does it cost to produce this project? So the project developer needs to make enough that it makes sense. The second part is where it gets really interesting, Aaron. That is, what is the market willing to pay? Now, as I mentioned, in theory, one ton of emission reduction ought to be equivalent to another ton. That it is, if it's a qualified offset under VCS, et cetera, it has been proven to be additional, meaning in the absence of offset funding, it wouldn't have happened. It's real, we've measured it, it's according to a certain methodology or protocol, as Christine's talked about, it ought to be fine. But we are subjective creatures at the heart of it, right? Humans, if I'm offsetting my emissions, or you are, Aaron, you perhaps would prefer not to use an industrial emissions offset because you want to tell a really interesting story to your stakeholders. I want to tell the story of forest protection. I want to tell the story of the biodiversity that I'm preserving as a result of my activities in the markets. In that case, you will pay a premium for a credit because it's important to you. And the numbers of those credits are much lower. So you can find industrial credits, again, methane, et cetera, they were very much dominant in the markets for a long time. I didn't say the number of removals, but last year, so in a market that was about $1 billion, removal credits, I'm just guessing here, I think it was about $3 million of the $1 billion market. So, and that isn't even equivalent to kind of the numbers of tons reduced, because you have the Microsofts of the world who were paying up to $1,000 a ton for removal credits, which weren't even verified yet. Now, I don't want to get too complicated, but the point is there's very few removal credits. There's very few nature-based removal credits compared to the rest of the markets. So people who find that important will pay a premium for those credits. They're expensive to produce and there are very few to be had. Does that help?
Yep, it sure does. I do want to ask a quick question about government advocacy and how we get regulators to then value these credits outside of the voluntary market, I suppose.
Right. So as I said, there are two markets. So if once you have regulation involved, then it's no longer a voluntary market. Then it slides into the compliance side of things. So the federal government is, of course, and I see we've got people from DFO and maybe ECCC, but there are protocols being developed around how Canada responsibly cares for nature, and then how we, again, like every country is doing, there's something called a nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. Every country needs to meet certain targets. So it is kind of a jostling position right now, how countries will account for their natural carbon sinks, aka the boreal forest in our case, and seaweed, et cetera, and how the voluntary markets and private sector will do additional work to create projects and then sell those to corporate entities. It's a little bit, there's a lot of jostling, as I say, going on right now as to how that's all going to play out.
Great. So many more questions, and I really look forward to getting to know the Radicle team a little bit more over the next little while. As we look to wrap up this second session of Seaweed Days, I invite each of you to send a message to the audience here today in one word, what you encourage somebody to do today to make a positive impact.
Thanks very much. I will do that. And I guess it's back to Mark to wrap it up. Thanks for having us today.
Great. So first and foremost, thanks, Chris, Jeff, and Christine. It's a lot of information, incredibly informative. Yeah, that's what I love about these conversations, is it often spurs on a lot more questions than where we're at, which is, was really our objective here, was to start a conversation. So again, thanks for that. I just want to echo this and kind of harken back to the beginning when we talked about this relationship with Van City and Radicle. So one of the things we're doing, and we are just at the starting line, and today's really the first presentation we've done collaboratively, but we are looking to formulate what we're terming a carbon cohort. So we're going to be looking for companies and organizations who are looking at getting on this journey. And I think really, I'm going to take from my takeaway here is there's two sides to this. There's really I'm an existing company today and I want to figure out how to measure and reduce. And then there's the other piece, which we're all working toward here. So I'm going to put my seaweed industry hat on here, which is really about leveraging those emerging opportunities. And I'll echo and reinforce the word emerging opportunities in seaweed. I would say from a science standpoint, we're working to leverage all the information and data we could find globally. We really don't know what we don't know today. That's part of the piece that makes it so exciting for all of us. So we're thrilled about that. If you're interested in learning a little more about what that carbon cohort might look like, or where you might be involved, just shoot an email off to info@seaweedindustry.ca and we can follow up. We're certainly connected here with all the folks at Radicle and we can start those conversations. conversations. The last thing I would be remiss if I didn't state, we're, as an industry association, we're working in all aspects of the industry, from government conversations to exciting initiatives like that. We'd be thrilled to have folks have a look at our organization. Again, we're seaweedindustry.ca. And if there's an appetite for your organization to join our organization for the next few weeks, magically, if you put Carbon 101 in as a promo code, there is an incentive to join. So with that, and I think you're going to get 3.5 minutes back in your day. Christine can carry on with world domination, perhaps another ocean depth. Again, can't thank everybody enough. I think Elizabeth Sheehan was on this call, who I've worked with from the onset of this with Radicle. We're, as an association, thrilled. This is really the beginning of our journey together. So with that, everybody have an amazing Monday. Great way to start the week, lots of energy, and we look forward to furthering these conversations. Thank you, everybody. Take care.